Hey there, I'm Kevin Downey, and I run an agency called Kevin M. Downey, where we help B2B companies with their sales and marketing efforts. You can visit our website at kevinmdowney.com. Okay, today's topic, why you shouldn't outsource your sales or business development work for your company or reps when you're in B2B. Okay, so this topic I've covered in various videos before, kind of piecemeal, I guess, but specifically to this topic, I want to dig into what's changed and over time in the business development space in particular in B2B for reps and why no longer can I recommend that you outsource that function. Now, there are exceptions to this rule, but in general, why shouldn't you outsource this function? The reality is at one time in the United States, you could say starting in the, I think, 80s, 90s, probably, you saw this increase of call centers overseas, very low cost. Obviously, you're outsourcing, so you're paying 2 to 3 times the base pay of the rep, for example. And you've got a full timer, and English is their second language, and they're very scripted, and they're on a dialer, and just motoring through calls, right? And it could work effectively enough because there was enough answers, enough times that you could get a hold of a decision maker in a day to make a very scripted call like that work, right? So the challenge with overseas reps typically, and I would say call centers in Latin America, if you're outsourcing, we see some of the same issues, but not quite as bad, is that they can't have a dynamic conversation, especially about your business. That's why they need to work for you. So the call centers, again, they can be very scripted because they can land so many conversations with decision makers in a day. It was a math game, right? And so they could be very scripted and get those leads. Now, let's cut to the exception right now first. So the exception is pure research that needs to be done. So gathering decision maker info, finding out if the company has general pain point. They produce hazardous waste, for example, and your company needs to know that. You can outsource that to a BPO, to a firm overseas or in Latin America. And generally speaking, because it's such a simplistic question, it is very scripted and it does not need a dynamic conversation, that you can get away with that and it can work. Right now, would I still hire my own rep to do that? Of course, because there's a cost savings there, right? But you can outsource that and make it work. But when you start digging into what most companies need in B2B, which is lead generation and appointment setting, there's so many steps in the process, and getting a hold of decision makers is so much more difficult today. So in other words, they've got to be multifaceted in approach. You've got, different channels, that multi-channel, as we said, using different channels. And then, of course, they've got to be able to have a dynamic conversation. And the reality is that outsourced reps aren't going to be able to do that very often. It is very rare where I come across a firm that sets reps up that can do that. Now, exceptions to that, I know of a couple of firms in the United States, but the reps are getting paid, 40 to 60,000 a year, and they're charging you, and they're remote, right? And they're charging you double of what that rep costs, which is the normal math model for outsourcing, right? It's 2 to 3 times base. So you're taking a rep in the United States, let's say they're 40 grand, now you're going to pay 80. If they're 60 grand, you're going to pay 120. Yeah, they can do a really good job, but you can build that internally just the same, right? But it is an option, and I know of a couple of firms that are actually pretty good. But in general, you gotta bring them in-house because you're not gonna have enough conversations in the course of a day-to-day work to make a very scripted dialer setup work anymore. There's too many phone trees. You don't get enough answers from receptionists. When you go to voicemail, you don't get enough answers. You're leaving voicemails. So there's a lot more moving going on there that outsourcing to a BPO overseas, for example, or a call center, where they're just purely scripting and they're just trying to get a landed call. And if it's not the decision maker that answers the phone, they're not going anywhere, right? That it's just not going to work anymore when you're trying to have dynamic conversations. So long story short, you want to bring that in-house. You want to have a rep or reps that works for your organization. Set them up with a dedicated process. Show them train them on what you need them to do in the outreach process. And we do that all the time, obviously, with what we do for clients in recruiting and training reps. But you've got to build them a process. You've got to give them a good prospect list. You've got to teach them, how to find out and gather decision maker information. How do you then get to that decision maker? Obviously, the conversation they need to have with the decision maker once they do get them on the phone. And you're only talking about, landed calls with decision makers somewhere in the vicinity on a full-time rep of 5 to 20 a day. I would say 10 or so is pretty average. Again, it depends on how effective you can be with voicemail. Your reps can be with voicemail. When we train reps, we'd like to see almost 50% of all calls with decision makers actually come from, callbacks off of voicemail. But you got to know how to use voicemail really effectively and train the reps on that. So anyway, overall, outsourcing lead generation in B2B doesn't work anymore. It just isn't. We're just having too much time. There's too much difficulty in getting hold of decision makers to make very scripted reps work, right? They can't have enough dynamic conversations. Again, there's exceptions to that rule. And of course, you can have reps that you outsource that are just gathering intel. They're getting one piece of information or something like that. And you could outsource that process. But when you get into a dynamic conversation need to generate leads or appointments, it's just not going to work in general in B2B anymore. Got to bring in your own BDR, SDR team. Okay. Hopefully that helps you. Reach out to us if you need some help. We've got reps available in the United States for direct hire. Of course, we always have reps in Latin America available. We get about probably 5 qualified reps a day from Latin America. So some really, really good talent. Okay. Really appreciate you being here. Thanks so much. And we'll talk to you soon. Thanks.